Hello, so I'm trying something new here. I'm going to do a quick rundown of the latest Node.js release. Depending on how this goes, I might do more of them. This is a fun way for me to dig into some of the details of what's going on, but hopefully I can help you understand some of these things as well, and maybe give you some tips on how to look through these things yourself as they come out. So this release came out on the 2nd of November. So currently that's about 6 days ago as of recording. It's Node version 11.1.0. So it's the current release, which means this is not LTS. Version 11 is not destined to be LTS. This is just one of those release lines that is about between 6 and 8 months of life, and you probably shouldn't put it into any serious production use, but it's good for command line tooling. It's good for playing with what's coming up next. These things are pretty popular, so a lot of people are keen for the new features that come out in them. So these are the things that I want to look at that I've identified as the top items. So ICU 63.1, I'll explain what that is when I get into it. I'm going to be looking at top level await and for await of, and I should say that's in the REPL. Top level await is not new for this release, but for await of is. But I thought I'd take this opportunity to explain top level await in the REPL because it's quite interesting. There's a timers bug that was resolved. I'll look at the details of that. fs.readFile and fs.writeFile. There is somebody, well, this has been known for a while apparently, I wasn't aware of it, but there's a discrepancy in the way that it works with file descriptors. So if you provide file descriptors for WriteFile and ReadFile, they work slightly differently. So we'll look at that. For now, it's just documented, but there's work going on to do more about this. There's some notes about the new QMicroTask global that's now in Node. That global is not new. It was new for the last release, but there's a doc change, and I just thought it'd be worth mentioning about that. And then there's just this minor feature API change to fs.open. Flags arguments now optional. So let's dive in and have a look at the release. So this is the release blog post on nodejs.org. You can see the date, and it was this is by Michael Zazo, who's otherwise known as Targos on GitHub. Now he's identified some of these major changes that that he thinks are notable. That you can see that they reflect some of the ones that I've pulled out as well, but if you look down through the list of commits, you can find some other things that might be interesting to you. I always recommend it's worth, if you've got the time to just browse through this. They're ordered alphabetically by subsystem, which means when the commits are added up for the release, the subsystem is the first little bit, and it's grouped and alphabetically ordered by them. So you can actually skip whole subsystems that don't matter to you. Like benchmark, I don't normally look at benchmarks changes because a lot happen, and they're just usually minor things. People adding benchmarks or shuffling them around. It's a bit like test. Build, it's how maybe it's changes to makefile or zip. There's some minor crypto changes in here. V8 got upgraded. It was just a pretty small bump. I haven't looked into details, but I'd say it's just minor fixes that V8 do. These happen pretty regularly. But we're still at V8 7.0. A couple of Semver minor things in here, and the interesting one is the ICU 63.1 that was pulled out. But these Semver minor changes, they're marked as Semver minor. They are what has dictated the jump to the 1. So this is not 11.0.1, it's 11.1.0 because of the inclusion of these two items here. And that just means that they are non-breaking changes, but they are feature additions. Lots of doc changes as usual. As always, the docs are really heavily kept up to date. There's 2 more Semver minors here, one in FS and one in lib. I will be digging into this first one, the FS open and open sync change. NAPI had a minor change. There was a memory leak in os.userinfo. Source of, it's like a grab bag like lib. You could scan through that if you want to find anything interesting. There was this is the top level for await of that was added, which I'll be digging into. Some streams fixes. Mateo's gone in there and done some things with async iterations. So streams is adapting to the async iterator world, and this is some edge cases that were cleaned up just to make that work nicely. Lots of test changes as usual. Normally just skipping over them is fine. timers, this is a bug that was fixed that was fairly important that I'll be digging into as well. A couple other minor things, including another ICU commit. Nothing particularly risky in here, I would say. So I would hope that there's nothing in here that's going to upset people's workflows and find major bugs, but you never know. The timers bug is an example of something that made it into Node 11.00, was found pretty quickly by a user, and then fixed and then expedited out into this release here. So anyway, let's dig in. I want to explain ICU 63.1. So ICU, what is this? So if we look at the pull request that put this in, it's from Stephen Loomis, who's with IBM, but he's one of the maintainers of the ICU library. And ICU is the Unicode package that bundles up a whole lot of Unicode utilities, and it's used by a lot of major software projects. ICU is used in browsers and everywhere else for adding really solid Unicode support for locales, for basic translations, number formatting, all that sort of stuff. So Node bundles ICU, and we just had a small bump. So these happen fairly regularly. As ICU releases versions, they get added into Node and released with it. Now, digging into the changes, we can see some of the things that he's highlighted. There's been some new languages added to ICU via the CLDR, which is it's the Unicode project. So there's this secondary project that it depends on. It's a bit like ICU is to CLDR as Node is to libuv. So these things, the CLDR gets bumped and then ICU does. There's some new languages. There's Sindhi, Maori, Turkmen, Javanese, Interlingua, Kurdish, Xhosa, and there's actually some more as well. I'll find them as well. And you can look into details by following this. If you are doing anything that is internationalization or localization, it's worth digging into what these changes and additions are. If you go to the this is the release page for ICU 63.1. You can see some of the things that have been changed in here. There's nothing huge in here other than the CLDR upgrade to 34. So that's where we get some of these changes. And if I go through to the CLDR link, you'll find this, and this is the CLDR 34 release notes. So we have support added for Somali, Javanese, Tongan, Konkani, Maori, Zonka, I don't know what that one is, Tatar, Kurdish, and Xhosa. And you can see that the nice thing about the CLDR page is it actually tells you what the keys are for them. And I can show you what they do. Now, Node comes with basic internationalization support, but because ICU is actually really big, a decision was made around the Node 0.12 timeframe. So Node 0.12, and then when it merged with IOJS into Node 4, we solidified around how to ship ICU because the binary size went up from I think it was 8 megs to 20 megs, or the download size anyway. So the binary got a lot fatter because of ICU inclusion. The way to keep that down was that we decided to ship only a package called small ICU, and that includes really basic English localization. So you don't actually get any of these additional languages and localization support in the default Node binary. However, if you are doing anything with localization with Node, then you'll probably want to build your own Node binary. I'm not aware of anyone that's shipping them with large binaries. You can either build with the full ICU, or there is a way to install it with a package. I'm going to show you quickly how to build it with the full ICU. It might be worth some time covering the package version, but so let's hop in and look at the Node code base. So this is my current Node master. Now, if I was to do a configure, oops, wrong window, with help, you can actually see that there's internationalization options here. The one that is important is with Intel. By default, all of the builders for Node ship with are built with Intel small ICU. So you can see that's the default there. But I'm going to go with full ICU. and then the other part is to do a download. So you've got to download this package from the ICU website. Because it's so big, it's not put in the Node Git code base. That was another thing that was decided. This download flag was added because we didn't want to make the repo even bigger because it was already pretty big. So let's try configuring that. So that's configuring the build. Now, if I was to do a make J8, then I could build it pretty quickly. But I happen to already have it built. So if I run the node binary here, I can see process.config. I can actually see ICU. And where is it? ICU small false. Which it actually indicates that it was ICU full. And we can see that the major version of ICU was 63. So that's what we've got. Now we can actually check some things out. What I want to do is just explain what localization in JavaScript is. So let's switch back to look at this browser window. And if you go to MDN and look up some internationalization options, you can find some interesting functions. One that might demonstrate this really well is date.toLocale date string. And they've got a really interesting demo here. And this will work in most browsers, I think. And in Node, some of it will work, but because it's only small ICU, you don't get the full feature set. So let's try and see what this does. So I'll copy these options. Just the nice thing about the options is when you do the date to string, you can get full dates. So you can get month names and days and the way that they shuffle things around in different locales as well. So let's copy those options and head on back to our terminal. So we'll go options. And if I go I can get the current date in my locale. So that's pretty straightforward. And I don't think that shouldn't change with most English locales, but you can do things in different languages. Then, as the ICU 63.1 gives us, we've got these new languages. So we can now do Tongan, and we can do Somali, and what else have we got? Kurdish and Xhosa. So basically it's just a localization mechanism, and to get the full support you need to compile with full ICU. So that's that one. Let's move on to actually, just before I close up on that, this page on MDN, the Intel object, which is a global in JavaScript, and now it's a global in Node as of Node 0.12 and 4. The Intel object has a bunch of utilities on it for doing some basic internationalization and localization. But there's also, if you go down to the bottom, you'll see some links to related methods. So on string number and date, there's additional methods that interact with the localization tooling. So all of these are supported in Node thanks to ICU, and you will get more sophisticated support if you have the full ICU package installed. So that's ICU 63.1. Next up, top level await and for await of. Now this change in Node 11.1 is just support for top level for await of. And you can, if you look at pull request 23.841 and look through the tests, you'll see that this is all it's doing. It's just the for await and then let of. So what that does is let you await on iterables. So if you've got an iterator that emits asynchronous function, asynchronous work, such as iterators or asynchronous functions, then you can do for of and use await, and it will do the usual async await thing within loops. And this is only in the REPL. So this has been working in normal Node for since we've had async await. The REPL is a different matter. This is only adding support for when you do Node on the command line and type in commands there. So I wanted to explain the top level await in the REPL. And to do that, how was I going to do that? So top level await. This was added back in, I think it was Node 11. Top level await in the REPL. So Timothy Gu added this one, and it was a bit awkward. So top level await has always been awkward in JavaScript just because of the semantics of how it works. It's even more awkward in the REPL because of how the Node REPL works. There's a lot of hackery that goes into the REPL to make it work so that it'll execute commands as you type them, remember history, and have the full Node context. So it's not a straightforward thing at all. So this was really awkward to get in, and it had to be backed out and then put back in again. And now it's in behind an experimental flag. So one of the things that had to happen for this to work was Node now bundles Acorn, which is if you know Acorn, it's a JavaScript parser written in JavaScript. So now when you type in commands to the REPL, it's actually parsing your JavaScript, and it does some basic transforms before it executes it in V8. So what this does is it takes something like await func, and then it converts it to this kind of construct and executes it. So instead of executing like this, which just won't work at the top level in V8, it'll turn it into something that can execute at the top level. So there's this hackery going on here under the hood to make it work. And for await of, the thing that's introduced in Node 11.1 sits on top of this hackery. So to get this working, you have to start Node with a experimental flag. This is experimental. So let's switch back to the command line and let's look at Node help. And then you'll see here experimental REPL await. So this, if you don't use this, you won't be able to get access to this. So experimental REPL await, and this is now using these new features. So looking at how this works, if we do, let's use a basic promise as an example. So if we do promise resolve 100, then that gives us a promise. Which is not very interesting, but somewhere the resolve function is called with 100, and that's just being swallowed up into nowhere. We can now do await promise resolve 100, and instead, so what's happening there is that the promise resolution is put onto the MicroTask queue, which is like the next tick queue in Node. We'll get to that in a later note here. And then is executed later. So after we hit enter, it goes through a loop and then executes. With await in there, it will pause execution until the MicroTask queue is executed and give us back that 100, so we can get it straight away. So we can do slightly more interesting things with this. We can, let's have a look at, this will work with async functions as well, which I'll show you. So I'm using promises just because that's the foundation of async functions. So let's do a new promise, and so what's this one going to do? This is going to resolve a promise after 1 second. And if I press enter, then there's a second going by and nothing's happening. So that's not very interesting. But now if I await on that, then it waits for a second before getting back to us. So we can extend that for 4 seconds and it'll do the same thing. So if we extend that into an asynchronous function, set timeout R for time. So is that going to work? I need to put another bracket there. So that's our async function. So we can look at that and say it's just not a plain function, it's an async function. If we execute that by itself, it just returns a promise. But if we await it, then we'll get our timer like before. So this will work now if you are loading modules that have asynchronous functions in them as well. You can do await. I don't know how useful this is going to be really in the REPL. I'd love to hear it if people are finding that this is a real level up. It just seems more like a, hey, this is something that should be supported, so let's support it. So that's extended to for await of as well now. Okay, next item, the timers pull request, which is 23.870. Now this builds on some work that, so Anatoly did some work on timers that went into Node 11. Now, timers is one of those things in Node that is extremely complicated because you want to support an arbitrary number of timers at an arbitrary resolution. You want them to be accurate, and you don't want performance to be degraded when you have too many. So if you've got 1,000 timers that all resolve in 10 seconds, you don't want to have 1,000 timers under the hood. Ideally, you just have one, and it would resolve them all in 10 seconds. So that's kind of what Node does, but it leads to some really complicated flows in there, and very few people understand it until they really dive into it. Most recently was Jeremiah Senkpeel, who dove into that and became the timers expert, and he's sort of thrown his hands up and walked away. And Anatoly has been brave enough to dive in there and do some refactoring and improvement of the timers under the hood. And unfortunately, he introduced a bug, which was only discovered by someone out there who reported it in 23.860. And we can see if we go to that issue that the report was like, there's a lot of stuff going on there. It's very hard to narrow that down. So a couple of people did some work to narrow it down. The report is basically that clear timeout will cause it to go up to 100% CPU usage and lock up. So an endless loop in there somewhere. Nikita came up with a reduced test case here, which is interesting. So it requires multiple timers to be in a queue. So you can see here he's queued up 5 different timers spaced 50 milliseconds apart, and then he's added 3 more timers on top of that queue. So these ones sit outside of this array. We've got a reference to all of these 5, and these ones are just unreferenced. And then for all the referenced ones, he's cleared them. And this is all within the same tick. So you set them, push them on, set some more, and then clear the first 5. And then it locks up with 100% CPU usage. That's the bug. It looks like it's a pretty sophisticated use case, but it's actually not. I can imagine a lot of places where this happens. So this is one of the reasons why Node current releases are not recommended for production, because you may find these things when it's too late. They happen with unfortunate frequency, simply because there's so many obscure edge cases that are impossible to test for. This one now has a test going in. You can see that Anatoly has put in some tests for it. So it's about, this is the new priority queuing that he's implemented. So there's a test in there now for this particular use case. And the fix is pretty simple. So this was expedited out into Node 11.10, not 0.1 as he hoped. So that's a pretty important fix to get in there. Next up, we have an interesting topic, and I'd love to hear feedback about this. Send me an email, leave a comment on this video. So this change is just a document change for now. The document change is here. This is the one that's referenced in the release, so it's 23.706. All it is changes to the FS API doc to add these 2 sections. One is in the fs.readFile section, and the other one is in the fs.writeFile section. So if I go over to the fs API docs, this is the big old docs that's getting huge. You can see now that fs.readFile has a section on file descriptors, and fs.writeFile, did I go past it? Has a section on file descriptors. Now, the interesting thing is the difference between them. So if we go to the ReadFile file descriptors, we can see that this third point is the important bit. When you do fs.readFile with a file descriptor, so that's the usage where you say instead of a path, you provide a integer, which is a file descriptor. So it's not a very common usage, really. I don't think I've seen anyone using fs.readFile with a file descriptor. fs.open, fs.read, fs.write, yes. They're the basic sort of foundational operations. fs.readFile, not so much. So I don't know how common this is out there in the real world. And the fact that this has gone unfixed for so long suggests it's not very common. So I wouldn't expect most people to be hit by this one. So the documentation just clarifies what's going on. So if you provide instead of a path string, you provide an integer, which is a file descriptor that's currently open, and you read, then, where is it there? The reading will begin at the current position. So the file descriptor in the kernel has associated with it a position. So it just points to a place on disk, essentially. And that place increments and decrements according to how you seek. So when you do fs.read, it'll start from wherever it is in the file, which might be halfway through. So, for example, if you have a file that contains hello world and you've already read the first 6 bytes out of there, you've read hello space, and then you do an fs.read file, you'll get world. So that's good. That's how file descriptors are supposed to work. That's quite normal. The RightFile version of it, though, so RightFile is the same. You can provide a file descriptor. It's got a discrepancy. The writing will begin at the beginning of the file. So if you had hello world in a file and you read the first 6 bytes and then you did fs.writeFile, then it would write over it rather than just starting at the end of it. This is not standard file descriptor behavior on Unix systems. So you would expect that if you wanted to seek a file descriptor, you would perform an operation that would move it, either explicitly moving it or doing something like a read or a write, which would move it. There's some code in Node that resets it to 0. So it resets at the beginning of the file whenever you do an fs.write. So that's a discrepancy. That has been fixed with documentation for now, because changing that behavior is going to be a breaking change. And if anyone's using it and depending on that particular behavior, any change to how Node works, whether it's to make fs.writeFile consistent with ReadFile or the other way around, people could be impacted, and it's very hard to know who. So there is a discussion. Where is it? Oh, here it is. So this is the issue number 23433, and Shakti outlines the current state of things and then provides some options. So these are courses of action. It's about whether we should make one consistent with the other or vice versa, or doing something else. And so he's outlined options that have come up that he can think of and that other people have proposed, and the TSC and other people are weighing into what they think about it. Now, I, along with most of the TSC who have weighed in, are going for option 1, which is simply to make RightFile consistent with the current file position. So bringing RightFile to be like ReadFile, it's a breaking change. It could break people in the ecosystem. Nikita is suggesting that we do that, but add a warning. So emit a warning whenever you have a file descriptor that is not at the beginning of a file when you're doing an fs.writeFile. So that may happen, but it depends on performance and a bunch of other things. So by node 12, I would expect this thing to be ironed out. For now, it's just a documentation fix. Okay, so that's fs.readFile and fs.writeFile with file descriptors. Moving on to our next item. What have we got? This one here, so issue 23885, this one's mine, and this is just a documentation change because I saw something go into node 11 that I personally wasn't happy with, and others agreed. So if you look at the node API docs under globals, so one of these documents is called globals. These are things that are not attached to an object. They're things that you can just call up, just like set timeout and clear timeout. There's a new one been added in Node 11 called QMicroTask. And the reason I wanted to bring this up just simply I just wanted to talk about what it was, because the change in documentation is to remove a section in here saying this is idiomatic, because it's not. This is only new in some browsers. I don't think you can even get this in the current version of Chrome, but it's coming. So what this is, it's like process next tick, but for the microtask queue. Microtask queue exists because of promises. So browsers had to implement, or JavaScript runtimes had to implement their own queuing and execution functions, just like the node next tick functionality, so that they could do promise execution or resolution, delayed promise resolution. So the microtask queue is like Node's next tick queue, but it's within V8. So we have the ability now to do QMicroTask. As I said, this will be making its way to browsers, and this is just like, it works just like process.nextTick. So potentially we could see people migrating to QMicroTask instead of process.nextTick. I don't think at this stage we can say which one's better or worse. NextTick I think is badly named, but that ship has sailed because it's not actually next tick of the event loop, but the concept is there. So it's experimental for now. It'd probably come out of experimental pretty quickly when browsers unflag theirs and it becomes common. And we may see a lot of code moving to this. So the important note here is that while it works similar to process next tick, it's managed by V8. And then the node's next tick queue is always processed before the V8 microtask queue within the turn of the event loop. So if you were to put a function on the microtask queue as well as on the next tick queue, what you put on the next tick queue will always execute before the microtask queue function. So those two queues, they will build up, but next tick will always be executed first, and then microtask queue will, and then the event loop will continue on in a full turn. You can see we're using the word turn here rather than the word tick, because tick is not has been sort of ruined by next tick. So it's not actually a full turn of the event loop in this next tick. Like if you had a bunch of them in next tick or microtask, they're not actually executing on a full loop. They just execute in it's like basically a for loop, one after the other. So that's that one. And then lastly, this one's really small. This one's a Semver minor for Node 11.1, and I don't know if many people will be using this. fs.open and fs.open sync now have their second argument is optional. That's all this is. fs.open will give you a file descriptor for opening a file that you can then do raw read and write operations on. And normally in the API docs, fs.open, you provide a flag, which is one of, I'll click on this. So append, read, and write is also down there. So a bunch of these, they work differently on different file systems, on different operating systems. So now, if you don't, this flag argument now is now optional, as you can see by the square braces around it. If you don't provide one, it will default to R. So before you had to provide one, but now it's read only. So if you want to do anything other than read a file descriptor or open a file descriptor for reading, then you'll have to provide one. Now it's optional. So that's that. That's all of the main things in this release that I wanted to talk about, and hopefully that's been informative. Please leave comments if this has been helpful, or you think I needed to go into less or more detail about something. Leave a like, I guess, if this was helpful to you. I'd love feedback. And that's all.